God bless you guys. Dios les bendiga a todos. Les queremos dar las gracias a todos ustedes que nos apoyan. Gracias por su cariño, gracias por su amor, que nos apoyan y comparten nuestro contenido cada viernes que nos unimos con ustedes. Les queremos dar las gracias y esperamos que nuestro contenido ha sido de bendición para cada uno de ustedes.
We also want to let you guys know that we did make an Instagram account. It's TG Table Talks. You guys can DM us. We have our email there if you guys want to email us and reach out to us regardless of what it's about. So yeah, you guys can find us there, follow us, and keep sharing our content.
And also, if you missed last week's episode or just want to rewatch any of the previous ones, you could search us up on YouTube under IDPMI ST Cloud FL.
See you next Friday. Dios le bendiga, Dios le guarde y regresamos en nuestro 17 episodio de Transcending Generation Table Talk. Le damos las gracias a todos ustedes por unirse con nosotros todos los viernes de 12 de la tarde a 1 de la tarde. Antes de comenzar vamos a iniciar con una oración, así que le voy a pedir a ustedes que nos está escuchando que cierre sus ojos y incline su rostro y oramos. Amantísimo Dios y Padre Celestial, te damos la gloria y te damos la gracia, mi Jesús, por un nuevo diamante de vida, Padre. Te pedimos, Espíritu Santo de Dios, Jehová, que lo que se hable, Señor, en el día de hoy, en esta tarde, Señor Jesús, Jehová, que tú por favor, Señor, alcances a aquellas personas, Padre, que nos escuchan, mi Jesús, sea en el radio, sea en la televisión, Padre, sea donde sea que nos escuche, Padre, que el testimonio, Padre, que vamos a escuchar en esta tarde, mi Jesús, Jehová, que tú seas, Padre, obrando, mi Jesús, Jehová, y que tu Espíritu Santo sea ministrando a cada persona, mi Jesús. Utiliza, Padre, mi Jesús, Jehová, al que va a traer el testimonio, Padre, y utilízanos a nosotros, mi Jesús, Jehová, para poder llevar, Padre, mi Jesús, lo que tú has hecho en nuestra vida, Padre. Te damos toda la gloria y toda la honra, mi Jesús, en el nombre del Padre, del Espíritu Santo. Amén, amén y gracias, Jesús. Bueno, estamos transmitiendo a través de Iglesia Pentecostal MI St. Cloud, a través de Facebook Live. Estamos también transmitiendo a través de Ángel Pastor Rosario, a través de Facebook. También estamos transmitiendo a través de IDPMI ST Cloud, a través de YouTube. También estamos transmitiendo a través de Apocalipsis Network Radio Televisión en Orlando con nuestro hermano Raúl Delgado. Estamos transmitiendo a través de Alianza Cristiana Up Network y sus afiliadas 87.9 FM, 690 AM, 1710 AM en Springfield, Massachusetts con nuestro hermano Jesús Arriaga. También estamos transmitiendo a través de ABA Streaming Radio en Wilmington, Connecticut con nuestro hermano Pedro Quiñones. También estamos transmitiendo a través de Radio Alabanza Viva 1710 AM en Bronson, Florida con nuestro pastor Antonio Matos. A través de Teleradio Luz 1710 AM en Eastern Pennsylvania con nuestro pastor Pedro Cruz. A través de Tuning Noblex Radio, RX Radio Brasil, Móvil Radio Box Europa y Asia y las 40 plataformas de las emisoras. En Roku TV o puede conectarse llamando al 605-477-9394. Nuevamente ese es el 605-477-9394 para los que no tienen aplicaciones o internet. Bueno, le damos la bienvenida nuevamente a todos ustedes que nos están escuchando y nos están viendo en esta tarde. Le damos las gracias nuevamente por sintonizarse con nosotros. Todos los viernes de 12 de la tarde a 1 de la tarde. Y en este mes estuvimos hablando, en el mes de octubre, estuvimos hablando sobre la apreciación pastoral y diciendo cuán importante es la familia pastoral, y estuvimos entrevistando a algunos hijos de pastores y algunos han traído su punto de vista en la cual ellos tenían la experiencia de que tristemente su padre ya falleció, pero aún así se mantienen firmes en la promesa del Señor y en la viña del Señor, y hemos visto también y he escuchado como algunos hijos de pastores que también se mantienen en el rebaño de su pastor y de su padre, aún así tienen su propia familia. Así que hemos tenido varias experiencias y hemos tenido diferentes puntos de vista de cómo ser un hijo de pastor. Pero en esta tarde tenemos a un invitado que nos va a contar de su experiencia, de cómo creció como hijo de pastor y cuando él tuvo su encuentro con el Señor. Amén. Así que antes de comenzar quisiera introducir a los que me acompañan en esta tarde, que es parte de la directiva de jóvenes de nuestros jóvenes de la iglesia local. Y vamos a tener a nuestra tesorera, nuestra hermana Iana Torres.
God bless you guys. I'm very honored to be here today.
Amén, amén. Y también tenemos a nuestro vocal, Iván.
God bless you guys. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me here today.
¿Iván qué?
Morales.
Morales. Bueno, amiga, es que tú sabes que con los nombres uno se le va. Pero bueno, vamos a empezar y tenemos hoy en esta tarde a nuestro hermano y amigo Héctor Torres.
God bless, guys.
God bless you.
Amén, amén. Y le damos las gracias nuevamente a Héctor, ¿verdad?
Thank you,
Por
guys.
decir que sí y por unirse con nosotros. Bueno, vamos a empezar y vamos a... Cuéntanos un poquito más de ti, Héctor. Cuéntanos de dónde te criaste, cuál es tu posición en el trabajo, qué haces en your life, what is it that you do?
Okay. You know, I was born and raised in New York, Long Island to be exact. Lived there pretty much till I was about 15, and then my family relocated to Orlando. Been here pretty much since. So my story starts off like many of the people that are probably listening right now. I grew up in church. I was fortunate enough to have an aunt who, although my parents at the time weren't serving Christ, she was a faithful servant. She's still to this day a woman of God. And I thank her for, she was the one that would literally take me to church with her every Sunday. I was a child, I was a baby, so I wasn't aware of what was happening, but the seed was planted at a very, very young age. As far as growing up in church, there came a point in my life as a young child that my mother has served the Lord in her youth, so she knew the Word, she knew God. My dad grew up Catholic, like most Spanish people, but my mom had the foundation of what it was to serve God in her youth, and unfortunately, as life went on, she ended up leaving God. And it wasn't until shortly after I was born, I ended up in the hospital. From what she tells me, I ended up with some type of a sickness and illness. The doctors didn't know what it was. But my fever, my temperature had spiked over 105.
Wow.
So as you can imagine, being a child with fever that high, she says she remembers seeing me laying in a bed of ice to try and get my temperature down. My blanket wasn't a blanket. It was literally a big Ziploc bag with ice in it to try and get my temperature down. Nothing they did was able to work. And at that moment, she was like, she had her moment. She had her moment with God and said, God, I know I don't serve you right now, but I know who you are in my life. And it's funny because this moment kind of symbolizes the faith that she has. And she just said, I make you a promise. If you heal my son, I will serve you the rest of my life. And she made that promise. She made that commitment between her and God. And then shortly after, she says maybe a couple hours passed, and the doctors came to grab her and said, your son's temperature is back to normal. We don't know what happened. So it's a testimony, one that I share proudly, because although I was a baby, I didn't know, but it's where God started working in me as in my personal life.
Wow.
So, through the course of my life, I've seen God, his hand in both my family and in my life. So I will forever be thankful for what he's seen me through, for sure.
Wow, y gloria a Dios, ¿verdad? Yo no sé si que no me acordaba de eso, pero en verdad que Le doy gloria a Dios, ¿verdad? Por eso, por ese testimonio y le damos todo gloria al Señor. Y gloria a Dios, ¿verdad? Por esas personas que siempre, que tú tienes en tu familia, que siempre se mantienen firmes ahí, orando por ti, sembrando la semilla, y que en tu caso fue tu tía, ¿verdad? Y le damos gloria al Señor porque ella siempre estuvo ahí sembrando la semilla, llevándote a la iglesia. Y yo creo que eso es muy importante, que haya una persona, ¿verdad? Que siga sembrando esa semilla, que aunque a la mayoría de la familia no le sirva, que esa persona, ¿verdad?, se mantenga firme en el Señor. Y ¿verdad? Y yo soy testigo de esa promesa de que tu mamá hizo con el Señor, porque hasta el día de hoy yo la veo. Y ella para mí es una inspiración, ¿verdad? Porque yo la veo como ella adora al Señor de todo corazón. Y cuando yo les he visitado a ustedes en la casa, yo la escucho cuando ella está orando y ella empieza a aclamar al Señor. Y en verdad, I love it. Every time I go over your house and I hear her sing, I love it. I love it. So, gloria al Señor por esa experiencia y por lo que el Señor hizo, ¿verdad? Y porque, y algunas veces, ¿verdad? Porque el Señor comienza a trabajar en una temprana edad de una persona, sin que uno conocerlo, ¿verdad? Y como todos sabemos, ¿verdad? Mi testimonio, y comparto esa palabra contigo, de que aún así, sin yo conocer al Señor, el Señor ya estaba trabajando conmigo. Y veo que también hizo lo mismo contigo, así que gloria y honra al Señor.
Not only that, but by the fact that God used you, because if you never got sick in the first place, the Hector I've seen today, the role model that I've seen today wouldn't have been, you wouldn't have been the same, So by God using you in from the very beginning, God has been using you, not only for yourself, but for your family as well. And that's like something very grand.
Glory to
Y
him.
tenemos a su hija aquí de testigo, que también ella también le sirve al Señor.
Yes.
Y eso es, I think that's beautiful.
Amen. I have a question for you.
Sure.
At what age did you start being the son of a pastor?
So my story is a little unique. I grew up in church, like I told you guys. And it was funny because initially, when that situation happened, my mom gave her life to Christ. Then we started visiting church, and church was a part of my life from that point forward. But my dad wasn't Christian yet. God was working through him and in him. And it's interesting because I was fortunate enough to see how God can take someone out of the world and use their testimony, use them for his glory. And I saw that with my father. I remember, thinking back, this is a while. I remember I was probably about my son's age now. I was probably about 10, 11. I was at that age where I wasn't yet a youth, but I hung out with the youth, and we were at un campamento. And I remember I grew up in a different, I grew up in Assemblies of God. And up north, every year, the youth have a huge campamento. And the thing at the very end of the campamento is a fogata. And what you do is you present your prayer request, you present whatever it is that you have in your heart to God there, and it's very symbolic. And my sister had ended up presenting her petition, which was, I want to see my dad saved. So she presented that, and shortly after we got back, my dad ended up coming to visit a church with us. It was a campaña. When you do those campañas in other churches, and God spoke to my dad there. And my dad ended up giving his life to God there. Why I say my situation is a little unique is because I'm sure probably some of the pastors' kids that you've had here, they probably have grown up being a pastor's child for most of their lives. My story is a little unique because although I was a pastor's kid, my parents actually didn't go into the pastoral ministry until later on in life. My dad was an evangelist. My dad actually opened churches in Brazil. He opened churches in the Dominican Republic. That was part of the ministry that he had. And my dad, would travel all around wherever they invited him to preach. My dad was there sharing the word. But my dad had a calling, which was to be a pastor. And it wasn't until
As I got older and I started seeing him getting more involved in the ministry of the pastoral ministry, starting off as an associate pastor and so forth, which is where, so I would say for me, to answer your question, it was a little bit later on in life, probably when I was getting closer to like the teenage years. I was getting, graduating high school, and that's when I was a PK, is how they, how you guys call them.
That's very interesting. Now, I would like to know how and when did you know God as an individual? When did that happen for you in your life?
So it's interesting because growing up in church and going to church almost every day, I felt like it was almost every day we were at church. I didn't have a relationship with God. Church was almost
Like a place that you had to go because your parents were.
it was mandatory. It was kind of like going to school, Many people go to school, but they don't have an education. They don't learn. They go to school just to go to school. For me, it was I'm going to church because that's what I'm told to do. But I started developing a relationship with God when I was about 12, 13 was when the light bulb went off for me. That was the first of many light bulbs. My light bulb sometimes goes on and off. So that was the first time where I had an encounter with God. I was, it was a part of, I was going to a church where our youth was on fire for God, and it reflected in all of us, our relationship with God. I can say at that point we were all seeking Him. It was almost like a thirst that you never were able to satisfy, and that was my first encounter with God, where I had like, man, I need to know more of God. I need more of Him. And then the more we saw Him, the greater we saw things. We experienced things that you only read in the Bible. We were able to experience it and as a youth. And that was like the beginning but it wasn't my full encounter. It was what kind of started, like the spark that started the fire, but it didn't light the fire all the way. It was kind of like, oh, okay, this is great. I love having this relationship with God. But it wasn't until I would say the relationship I have with God now, I established as I got older. It wasn't until I gave my life back to Christ after I had, backslid. It wasn't until I came back to God where God started working in me, and He started working in certain areas that I didn't know I had to be worked on. But I would say as I became older, it was when I have the relationship I have now with Him.
Okay. Y dice, ¿verdad? Very interesting that you said that you had, in your words, backslid.
Yeah.
Y vamos a entrar un poquito más en eso más ahorita. Pero ahí mismo, durante esos tiempos que fuiste hijo de pastor, ¿verdad? ¿Cuáles fueron unas ventajas que tuviste como siendo hijo de pastor? ¿Qué fue una de las cosas que tú dijiste, wow, yo si no fuera hijo de pastor, yo no podría disfrutar esto? ¿O que tú pudiste ver en tu padre, ¿verdad? Que tú dices que fue pastor y que pudo abrir iglesias. ¿Qué triunfos tú pudiste ver que él pudo cumplir y las puertas que se te pudieron abrir también durante ese periodo de que fuiste hijo de pastor?
I think one of the advantages of being a pastor's kid was the relationships you make. You make relationships that impact you for a long time. You make relationships that are there for a season. And for me, it was impactful because knowing some of the people that my dad partnered with in ministry, and people that I'm still friends with to this day. And there's people that I know that I can just pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, I'm going through something right now. They won't think twice to stop what they're doing. And people of faith, that you need that. You need to surround yourself with that. So I think that's a huge advantage that you have. Seeing my dad being able to open churches in other countries was impactful for me because, it's the Great Commission. It's what God calls us to do.
Making a change in the world.
Yeah, and seeing him do it, for example, I remember his trip to Brazil was impactful for me because my dad doesn't speak Portuguese, and going over there and seeing him being able to start this church and seeing the church start from the ground up and seeing them like be able to or now the church has continued to grow, and it's just great to see how you can plant a seed in a community. We talk about how the seeds are planted in us, but to plant a seed in a community, see how that seed has flourished and has affected that community is tremendous.
Especially when that community is not yours, because you're going to other places to impact, to spread the word of God.
Yes, amen.
Yeah, y de curiosidad, what part of Brazil did he go to?
Belo Horizonte.
Oh, Belo Horizonte.
Yeah.
That's nice. I want to go. I want to go.
So yeah, now that you've spoken about the advantages, which, like, by the way, como que I really like the advantages, como que seeing especially your father in action, you know, when God tells to your dad you're gonna do this, and watching him doing it not only impresses, you know, you're impressed because of your father, but because of God, because whatever he says comes true.
Amen.
But now that we spoke about the advantages, what are the disadvantages of being a pastor's son?
I think, and they maybe have talked about this in the other people that have come here. Me personally, I feel when you talk about a pastor's kid, I feel like you live in a fishbowl. I feel like, I don't know if you've ever seen a fishbowl. Everybody always tends to just look to see what the fish is doing.
And tap on it too.
And yeah, and that's what it's like. You constantly have people's attention, and it's one of those things where, you know, they only focus on the negative. It's almost like a stigma that as a pastor's son, they, you know, and truth be told, you know, a pastor is the head of the church. He is the example. So when you see a man of God, a holy man, you know what I mean? Yes, but he is man. He is not perfect. Therefore, the kids are not going to be perfect, you know? And the reality is, as you guys go through, as you know, as a pastor's kid, as you grow through life, you're going to make mistakes. You know what I mean? It's impossible not to make mistakes. You know, and I think sometimes, unfortunately, the one thing that the church in general, and, you know, I don't mean to offend anybody, but they know how I am. I speak things very transparent. You know, the church could be the first to judge, to point the finger and make people feel. That's why you see a lot of pastors' kids leave church, because of the judgmental aspect of the church. And, you know, if there's anything I can you know, implore the church out there is, you know, don't judge, you know, pray, see what they're going through and offer prayer, because they're human just like everybody else. They go through the same struggles, if not at a worse scale, because sometimes you feel like you don't have anybody to turn to, because the only people that are around you are there to
point fingers at you,
and you don't want to disappoint.
Yeah.
You don't want to see someone that is looking at you like, oh, this is the pastor's kid, you know? And they're like, man, but the pastor's kid really made a huge mistake, and you don't want to say nothing because you don't want to let that person down. There's a weight on your shoulders that, like, there's a responsibility that honestly doesn't belong. You should be able to live your life and as, again, according to God's word, obviously, but understand that when there's mistakes made, we need to have people there to help pray and help uplift, not bring down.
Yeah, I mean, in my perspective, I'm not a pastor's son, but from what you've told me, I mean, being a pastor's son, it has to be like a lot of pressure, you know, living up to your father's expectations, because you can do many good things. When I say many, I say many good things. You can help people see Christ. You can do this, you can do that. But if you make one mistake, they're never gonna let you forget it. They're going to be like, hey, remember in 1970 something when you did that mistake?
At 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
At 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
It's true. And that's the unfortunate thing. And I think that's just, unfortunately, I think, you know, some people are just built that way. And you're never going to change people. It's important for any pastor's kids out there listening is, you're not going to change the judgment that's coming. You just need to learn to deal with it and understand where it's coming from, and understand that at the end of the day, you have a God that you serve that's loving. Yes, he will correct you when you make a mistake, and when we make mistakes, we deal with the repercussions of the sins that we have. But there's always grace. There's always there's always his love and his mercy, and we can't forget that.
this fishbowl and you felt this pressure upon you to be perfect, what did you do to overcome it or to face it?
It's hard to answer that question because I don't think I fully was able to do the right thing. I think for me, I was one of the many that kind of just started distancing myself. I'll tell you this much. I actually stopped going. I actually went to a different church just to avoid that. My parents had their own church, but I was a member at another church just because I didn't want that stigma. I didn't want that. I regret it because I feel like, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about this a little bit, I feel like, you're there as a pastor's kid to help support your parents' ministry. And I do have that regret because I do feel like, I didn't support it to the fullest, but I also didn't want the judgment that I felt was coming.
And that's sad that sometimes, we take decisions like that, because of fear, because we're scared of this person's gonna, they're gonna say this, they're gonna judge me, they're gonna look at me differently. Y es triste, ¿verdad? Cuando tomamos decisiones así que, pues, tú sabes, por temor, tomamos decisiones por temor algunas veces y eso es muy triste. Ahora, te pregunto, durante este periodo de hijo de pastor, ¿cuáles fueron una experiencia que más te impactó a ti, sea negativo o positivo? ¿Cuál tú dirías, en mi vida eso me marcó como un hijo de pastor? Sea positivo, sea negativo. ¿Qué tú dirías que, Tacho, en mi vida de como hijo de pastor, yo puedo decir que este fue el highlight? Que puedo decir, nunca me voy a olvidar de eso.
I'll give you both. Okay. The highlight I would say was to see my parents' church grow rapidly. It was awesome to see how they were able to take, what was a handful of people and it started growing fairly quickly. Unfortunately, though, like many tragic situations, it didn't last very long because, unfortunately, and this is the area that was impactful to me was, my parents ended up going through a divorce. And it's interesting because they always say hindsight is 20/20. When you look back, things look clearer to you when you look back at things, right? Because you look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But for me, the reason it was impactful was because little did I know that the process God took me through was needed, and I feel like because God was preparing me for the calling He had over my life. I unfortunately, in my lifetime, have seen many pastors fall. And unfortunately, my dad, isn't perfect, and he made a mistake, and it was very impactful, very, very impactful for me because, one, he's your dad. So you have to separate the pastor and look at the human, which is the father. And to this day, he is the guy I look up to. Like, he is, despite his flaws, he is the person that, he's like my best friend. Like, I can call him, tell him how I'm feeling, and he always has the right thing to say, and when I look at the pastor and I see the man of God and what he went through and the errors he made, I learned from that because I understand that I have the same calling over my life. And now I know what I don't need to do and what doors I don't need to open to avoid making the same mistakes that he made. It was impactful for me because through that process, I experienced a lot of hurt. I experienced a lot of pain. It took years. They say time heals wounds. I think time helps you cope with the pain. The only thing that can heal the wound is God, is having God in the mix and giving that pain to Him. And I can share with you guys that it wasn't until I became a father that God started the healing process for me. That girl you see over there, God started working in my life because I started looking at things differently. I started looking at it and saying, well, wait a second, the same way you look at your father, they're going to look at you. You know you're not perfect. So, what are you going to do when you disappoint your child? What are you going to do when you let them down? So that started the process of me healing. Through that process, I actually started giving my life, I gave my life back to Christ, and I started going back to church. And obviously through prayer, and presenting these things to God, God started the healing, not only in my life, but in my family's life. And I always think, like I said, it's unfortunate sometimes because I think things happen obviously for reasons. God doesn't allow things to happen, and in anything that God that allows in your life, He's going to glorify Himself in. But I know that, sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, we have to reap what we sow. So when we make the bad decisions, there's consequences to that. You know what I mean? For the longest time, I felt like I failed as a PK because I felt like, well, what if I was there supporting the ministry? Would things have been a little differently? Would decisions have been made differently if I was there? Because I had stopped going to church when they were still in the ministry. I had stopped going to church, and I think I went through a rebellious stage like most youth will go through, So it's one thing that marked me for sure.
I like how your father said, I like how you said that the path that your father took, you tried to avoid his mistakes. I think we're all of us, like the three of us, we're older siblings. We have younger brothers. And my brother told me once, Ivan, I know you're my older brother because every time you make a mistake, I try to avoid it. I mean, I'm the one that says the right from wrong. I'm the one that gets, I'm the one that gets my attention.
You're the example.
I'm the example.
Exactly. My little brother once told me, he was like, I mirror everything you do. So if you do it, I'm going to do it. So.
But if you get scolded, I'm not going to do that.
Exactly.
I'm going to
So
avoid
that's why
that.
you have to be careful with the actions you make and what you say also, because that can have a really big impact.
Yeah, because your little siblings, I mean, anybody really, they can look up to you. You're not even noticed, so you have to be an example. Everywhere you go, you have to be an example. Because someday, someone's gonna walk up to you and say, "You're my role model." And if you've been living a life away from God, you're gonna be like, "I'm a terrible role model."
I'll take it even a step further. Let's take it out of the context of family. We're role models to the people that we impact daily. Our coworkers, our schoolmates. Excuse me. Just like we set the example for the people in our personal life, we have to be the example as Christians for those people that we meet. We should have an impact in every person's life that we meet. It should be a one of showing God's love, showing God's mercy, and setting an example. So when they look at you and they say, "There's something different about this person," and as the more they get to know you, they understand that what's different inside of you and from them is Christ.
So this is the question of, I saw this question, I'm like, wow, I get to ask this question, it's very exciting. So, do you consider yourself part of being the pastoral family, or do you consider yourself being the family of a pastor? There's two different things. Pastoral family means that you're part of the ministry, but if you're the family of a pastor, that's his ministry. I don't want to be part of this. So what do you consider yourself?
Right now, or at the time? At the time? Okay. I think at the time I understood I was part of the pastoral family, but my action said I was the opposite. My action spoke of the latter, which was that I'm a member of a pastor. I'm a family member of a pastor. And you're right. It's good. It's important to make the distinguish between the two. It's important for us to understand our role in the ministry as a pastor's kid. The calling falls on the pastor, but we're there to play a support role in their ministry. As we play that support role and we develop our relationship with God, excuse me, we develop our own calling over our life. And then at some point we leave that ministry and we start our own ministry, but you're always still part of the pastoral family. I think when I look at that question, I think one is a mindset. The other one is how you act. You know, if your mindset is that you are part of a pastoral family, then you're going to be part of that ministry. The other one is an attitude like, I'm not part of that. I'm just part of the family, you know? So I think that's the difference between, for me, those. I felt like I've had a little bit of both, to be honest.
Amen. We are very much enjoying your story so far and learning from it. We are going to go on a quick break, and we will be right back to Transcending Generation Table Talk.
God bless you guys. God bless you guys. God bless you guys. Dios les bendiga a todos. Les queremos dar las gracias a todos ustedes que nos apoyan. Gracias por su cariño, gracias por su amor, que nos apoyan y comparten nuestro contenido cada viernes que nos unimos con ustedes. Les queremos dar las gracias y esperamos que nuestro contenido ha sido de bendición para cada uno de ustedes.
We also want to let you guys know that we did make an Instagram account. It's TG Table Talks. You guys can DM us. We have our email there if you guys want to email us and reach out to us regardless of what it's about. So yeah, you guys can find us there, follow us, and keep sharing our content.
And also, if you missed last week's episode or just want to rewatch any of the previous ones, you could search us up on YouTube under IDPMI ST Cloud FL.
See you next Friday.
And we are back with our brother, Hector Torres, and continuing with what we were speaking about, his experience as a pastor's kid and what it was like. Now we're going to go a little more in depth about rules and kind of regulations, what it was like living at home. Now, as a pastor's kid, were there certain things you weren't allowed to do? For example, like I know your sister, my aunt, she told me you guys weren't allowed to go to the movies. Was there anything else you guys weren't allowed to do? Why?
I think growing up, we grew up very, very strict household. There was a lot of, I think back in those times, a lot of people grew up that way. We weren't allowed to go to the movies. We weren't allowed to watch certain TV shows. We weren't allowed to, my sister couldn't wear pants. So there was a lot of very strict doctrines that we had to follow. For us, it was normal though, because that's how we grew up. We didn't see it as like, oh my God, it wasn't the end of the world for us. We just were like, oh, okay. As I got older, I started to, start learning a little bit more about what the Bible said. I started differentiating which was what God's word said versus the dogmas that we grew up with, which was the kind of the bylaws that we had to follow as part of the church that we were going to. So there were some times I think that's part of what started the rebelliousness, which was starting to question things. I remember I had a conversation with my father because I want to go to the movies. All my friends went to the movies. They go, why can't I go to the movies? You know, and there's a verse that everybody, I'm sure, as I say this, those of you watching know what I'm talking about. It was the no se sienten, sienta de. I can't say it in Spanish.
Psalms 1.
Yes.
Bienaventurado el varón que no se sentó en silla de escarnecedores.
Yes. So, you know, I challenged my dad on that and the context of what was being said in the Bible. And, you know, that was one of the things that I actually love about my parents is they were always willing to hear us. And you know, if you made a valid enough point and obviously it was Christ-centered and it was, you know, biblical, my dad, I remember him telling me after we reviewed that and debated, he saw my point. He was like, okay, you can go, you know, but that wasn't until I was older, you know. Yes, but we were raised very, very strict as far as rules and regulations. We had them all.
And going a little bit more into depth after your experience of being a pastor's kid, después de ser hijo de pastor, ¿verdad? Porque mencionaste ahorita, antes de que nos fuimos a una pausa, que tus padres fueron y pasaron por el proceso de divorcio. Y ahora te pregunto, ¿eso fue durante ellos estaban en el ministerio o ellos ya habían terminado el ministerio y después se divorciaron?
They were still in the ministry when everything kind of happened, and my parents ended up getting divorced while they were still pastoring, and obviously as a result of that the church went through a transition, and you know, that was when they stepped down from ministry. So it was during that time that happened.
And did the ministry continue? Did it went to a certain stop?
No, actually the associate pastor ended up taking over the church, and it had continued for quite a while. I'm gonna be honest, I haven't followed up to see if it's still running, but I know that at some point, you know, they had continued with the ministry. The people that because there was people that were still going to the church, so yeah, the ministry continued afterwards.
Oh, that's very good.
Yeah,
very interesting. So because you know when pastoral families sometimes, you know, get divorced, you know, sadly it happens, but churches fall because since they no longer have a role model, they have no you know, like it's like sheep without shepherds, they get lost. So since the pastoral family, you know, ends up getting divorced, then it's a good thing. I mean, it's very relieving to hear that the associate pastor took over.
Yeah, and you're right. Oftentimes when a church goes through something like that, and it's happened to a lot of churches, you hear it, you know, the big pastors, you know, they're all human. Things happen, and unfortunately, you know, sometimes we just pray that God restores the person, that marriage, that relationship, that ministry. But when churches end up having people leave when something like that happens, it's because a person did not have their eyes on God. They had their eyes on man. Yes. And that's a problem that a lot of believers have.
That's very unfortunate.
They get very focused on the man that's standing up there, that's delivering a great word, which they don't realize it's not the man, it's the person that the man is seeking, which is God. That's who we need to put our eyes on. God's perfect. He's never going to let us down. But when we put our faith and our hope and our everything on man, that's when you have people that get so heartbroken when something like this happens that they just leave the church. Yes. Because they feel like, oh my God, you know, this happened to this person. You know, if that's the case, they never had their eyes on God.
People who pay attention to man instead of God are the type of people that I know everybody has heard this phrase before, that if this person doesn't say hi to me, I'm gonna get mad and I'm leaving church.
Yeah.
You know, we've had como que, yeah. So when people focus on what's around them instead of what's above them, so since they're looking at everywhere instead of God, they're gonna get lost. Which is, you know, very unfortunate now these days.
Yo creo que es triste, ¿verdad?, que pase eso dentro del ministerio y de la iglesia, porque como tú dices, llegan a un punto de que pues los miembros se van Y hay personas que son recién convertidas que cuando ven eso, que el pastor se divorció en el ministerio, pero me daba consejo de mi matrimonio, o sea, y ellos empiezan a cuestionar de que, pues si ellos se divorciaron, ¿cómo yo voy a hacer, cómo mi matrimonio va a triunfar? ¿Entiendes? Y pues yo creo que es muy triste porque también da el caso que también tristemente se divide la iglesia y pues tú sabes, y yo creo que es muy triste, muy triste.
Now I wanted to ask, how did you come back to the Lord? Like, what allowed you to come back to?
So like I mentioned earlier, it wasn't until so during my time away from God, which I say away from God, but God's always there for you. It's us that we kind of turn off.
Y antes de que te continúe, te
Yeah.
pregunto, ese periodo de que tú estuviste alejado del Señor, ¿cómo te sentiste? ¿Tuviste un vacío? ¿Pudiste llenar ese vacío? ¿Cómo pudiste, tú sabes, llenar ese vacío que buscabas?
So, when I went through my process and I ended up leaving, I'm thankful I didn't go into anything deep. I'm thankful to God that I never had addictions or anything like that. So I don't want anybody out there to think, I went, the opposite side and I was a drug addict and everything. No, but, I went through my rebellious stages and, I had my, you look at making friends, meeting people to try and, fill that void of being wanted, of love, and you go into different relationships because of it. And for me, when I was in that world, I remember I always put up a front. So people that saw me always thought this guy is he's happy, whatever. But very few people who actually knew me knew the stuff I was struggling with and knew the pain I was suffering. I have two best friends. One unfortunately has passed away, but my other best friend, she's like my other sister, and she was there through this whole process. And it's always important, and it's funny because when the foundation is there, even though you're away from God, things always turn you back to Him. It's crazy how that works. And it's funny because at the time, me and my friends, we were all separated from, we were all in the world. But it was funny because oftentimes when we were going through our things, we would end up preaching to each other. And you need to leave that in God's hands. You need to pray about that. And it was I think about it now and I find it funny and comical because here we are, in an area probably that the least thing you're thinking about is God, and we're talking about God. Or a situation happens and the first thing you think about is you turn to God, So for me, when I was going through my process, I understood what I needed to do. I was fortunate enough to meet this beautiful woman who stole my heart. And she was in the same shoes as I was, which is funny. Two broken people coming together. Isn't that ironic, right? And I remember when my wife and I first started dating, the one thing that we actually connected on, aside from many things, was our foundation. She had that foundation of growing up, having her grandma take her to church, So it was something that we understood. If we're going to make a decision to spend the rest of our lives together, we have to do it right, and we have to involve and make God the center of our relationship and our marriage. And that was the process that God started taking me through. And and honestly, when I became a father, I understood I needed to stop living the life I was living. I understood, like I told you guys earlier, that I had to set an example for all of my kids as we continue to grow our family. And I knew that example was only going to be a Christ-centered one. I didn't want to raise my kids because I wasn't, I wasn't raised, I wanted to raise them the way I was raised. I wanted them to have that foundation of God in their life, So I understood in order for me to do that, I had to step up and be not only the man of my family, but, the man God called me to be.
Yes. And have you seen any changes in your life? Because when one is a Christian, once living well, I mean not well because our lives are not perfect. If we have perfect lives, then God, will be no use of us.
Yeah.
But we went, like, as Christians, we know that God is there with us, and we're not empty. But have you seen any changes in your life? Any changes?
Just in general. Yeah, I mean, I've seen, as I've gotten older and I've gotten closer to God, I've seen my relationship with Him grow more and more. From a marriage standpoint, as a married couple, my wife and I, we got married very young, and we saw the difference in our marriage with and without God. I've seen God's faithfulness in my family. I've seen Him, He's never let us down. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm thankful that I'm the decisions. I'm thankful for everything I've gone through in life, because it's taught me something, and it's kind of prepared me for the calling God has placed in my life.
Yeah, I had to ask you this question because I'm sure that there's people watching that are saying maybe God isn't, what I thought it would be. So probably people leave church thinking that God is the problem, when it's actually, their lives, that they're not fully developed to God. Since they're not fully developed, they still feel this void. Even though they're sitting on a chair in a church, they still feel this void and that is because they don't take God, fully.
And to those people, I say, you can't put God in a box. You can't,
true.
My wife is famous for saying this, and it's true. You can't put God in a box. You limit God, you're gonna limit what he can do.
Yes.
You know what I mean? We have to live by faith, and we have to have faith that, regardless of our circumstance, our situation, God's gonna see us through. He's made that promise to us, and I think sometimes, we allow the struggles of life and the challenges of life to put us in a position where it affects our faith, and it affects, the faith that we have in God. You know what I mean? It's like, well, yeah, God, I know you can do this, or sometimes we question, like, why haven't you done it?
Yeah.
And a lot of it has to do with patience, and I'm sure that's another topic you guys can do in the future about. But yeah, you're right. It's something that I think as Christians, and I would tell anybody listening out there, when you're looking at God in your life, and you're looking at why hasn't something happened, look at what have you done. What have you done to seek God? Are we just sitting back expecting God to just do a miracle in our lives?
It doesn't work that way.
God's not a genie.
Yeah.
We don't rub a lamp and ask for 3 wishes and God grants them. This takes us seeking Him and building a relationship with Him, and then you see the effects of that. You see God's faithfulness in your life when you do that.
Amen. And going back to her question that she asked you earlier, how was it that you finally, that at the end, came to the feet of Christ? Earlier that you mentioned her, that God had used her. So how was it that God had used her in that way to bring you back to His feet?
I think it just simply knowing that I was gonna have a little human that I was gonna be responsible for, that I was gonna be responsible for raising, that I was gonna be responsible for setting an example for. It made me realize and self-analyze and say, well, are you even ready for this? Are you even prepared for this? And that's when I thought, no, not necessarily, I'm not, and for me, I started looking at the spiritual aspect of it. And I started thinking and reminiscing about my childhood, and I started thinking about, well, the example that I was set once my parents were dedicated their lives to Christ was a great one, and it was great times. And I just remember saying, I want that for my children. I ended up going to a men's retreat, and I gave my life to Christ. I reconciled my life there, and it was the beginning of what God started in me. And then, as from that point until now, it's been a matter of me getting closer to God and understanding, okay, now what's my calling, God? Like, what is it that you have for me? And it's funny and ironic that we're talking about this because I used to hear my dad tell me this, and I used to, and I always thought to myself, I really didn't put too much thought to it as a young kid, because at a young age, you're really not thinking of your calling. And you're just thinking of, what TV am I going to watch? What TV show's on, Excuse me. But I remember as I got older, it was actually something that frustrated me. So I'm like, God, I want to know what it is. What is it you call me to do, And ironically enough, I had been told this a couple times, and not that I ever questioned it, but I'm always the type of person like, God, just like, can you really confirm this for me? And it's ironic because your father actually came to my house the first time I met him, and you guys had came to do a service at the house. We had just moved here to St. Cloud.
I remember that day.
And it was the one day, I can tell you guys, I can share now, it was one of those days I had gone out of work. I was already late. I was getting late for this church service at our house. And I remember being exhausted. And I just remember thinking, God, whatever you have for me today, just make it quick because I'm really tired. But then I remember in my heart of hearts, I remember telling God, you know my desire is to know what it is that you have for me. So if you can give me a hint of that tonight, that'd be great. I just kind of threw that little out there to God. And it's funny because the service was great. Your dad brought a word. And I remember afterwards, as all great Puerto Rican families do, we serve coffee and donuts and all the other little things to eat. Everybody's having a good time eating. And I remember I had went to your dad to ask him if he wanted coffee. And your dad said yes, but he goes, but before you go get me a coffee, he goes, I've been fighting with God since I came in to tell you this. And I said, God, if you present him to me to talk to me, then I'll tell him the word you have for me. And I said, well, I'm here. What is it that you got for me, God? And he goes, you've been wanting to know what your calling is. When Pastor uttered those words, my heart, I started getting nervous. I was like, oh, wait a second. What is this? Yeah. And he said, he's like, God put in my heart to tell you that, your calling is to be a pastor. And I was like, God, can we spin the wheel? Can we spin that wheel of ministries and pick something else? But it was this confirmation of what God has. So that's why I mentioned earlier, when I look back at everything I've been through, at everything that I've seen, when I see the men of God that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of the ministry and see, even including my own father, and I've seen the things that they've done positively and negatively in ministry, in life, in with regards to the family, I've learned from that. And I think it's not coincidental that God has placed that calling over my life, because I think it's important to, and it's the one thing I really appreciate of our pastors, and I think is the fact that there's balance between family life and the ministry. The first ministry God places in our is the family, so that's one thing I really cherish is understanding how to have that balance.
Amen. I find that amazing and for the glory of God. I remember that day. That day was interesting day. God did a lot that day. It was amazing to see how God works in our lives, and I know for me, it's been an experience, and I know I'm kind of like a pre-pastor's kid, so I know it was coming soon, and I can't wait for it, but I know he's going to do such amazing things. Our last question for you today is, what advice do you have for the people listening that are pastors' kids that have left Christ, or that are struggling at the moment, pastor kids that are struggling, and that just need someone to talk to?
I think we kind of touched on it earlier. I think anybody, and not just pastors' kids, I think anybody who's left Christ in general, the one thing it's important to understand is your life's never going to be the same. It's not going to be the same as it was with God. When you think of your current situation and you think of it without God and you think of it with God, does it become better? Of course, because, God is going to, as I mentioned earlier, God's going to provide. And I think sometimes we have to self-analyze as to why. What is it that church did to you, or what is it that made you want to leave? And the one thing is, and if your answer is, well, church did this, or church made me do this, or church made me that, the church is gonna fail you. But understand that God never did anything to you. God never caused you to leave. God never caused you to be bitter in life. That if there was a group of people that caused that pain, that caused that hurt, understand it was never God. So I think it's important for all of those out there listening, understand who God is in your life, and understand that the only way you're gonna have the joy that comes with serving Him, or I should say, to have true joy, is going to have the joy that comes with serving Him, and that's important. And if you're on the fence, if you feel that you've been pained or hurt, pick up the phone and call someone who that is Christ centered, that you can rely on to pray. And for those people listening that may know someone in that situation, I encourage you to reach out to them and extend a hand to just pray for them. Oftentimes, people think pastors' kids are stronger than what they are, and they're not. They're just human like everybody else. They hurt just like everybody else. And for us to think that they're superhuman or on a spiritual level, they're not. They need prayer just like anybody else. So I encourage everybody out there, pray for your pastors, pray for your pastors' kids, pray for their ministry, and pray that God helps them in whatever they're struggling with.
Bueno, le damos la gracia nuevamente a nuestro hermano Héctor Torre por haber compartido con nosotros esa hermosa historia de cómo fue tu vida como hijo de pastor, cómo fue cuando pasaste por el proceso, cuando te apartaste de los caminos del Señor y ahora estando en los caminos del Señor, como el Señor te ha llamado hacia el ministerio. Y oramos que el Señor te abra las puertas y te bendiga y te ayude y te dé las herramientas necesarias para ese ministerio. Y hemos visto, ¿verdad? Todos hemos visto en nuestra congregación como la familia de ustedes es una familia que fenomenal. Yo la amo a ustedes. Yo los amo a ustedes, en verdad. Y yo en verdad veo a Dios a través de ustedes porque ustedes tienen como un corazón como el de David.
And
Un
you guys are
corazón.
always smiling everywhere I go, yo.
Sí.
I'm like with a little rain cloud over my head.
Con una
God bless
paz.
you, Island. Yeah.
Con una paz. Pero nada, le damos la gracia nuevamente y le damos gloria a Dios por ese testimonio y le damos la gracia a todos ustedes que nos han acompañado este mes de octubre, que ha sido el mes de apreciación pastoral. Le damos las gracias a nuestro hermano Levi, que fue el que comenzó esta serie. Le damos las gracias a Lorena, que también comentó y que ella trajo su punto de vista y su experiencia como hija de pastor y estando aún en su rebaño del pastor, de su padre. Y le damos también gracias a Héctor por venir con nosotros y concluir esta serie. Así que le invitamos todos a ustedes que se unen con nosotros todos los viernes de 12 de la tarde a 1 de la tarde, ¿verdad? Y le damos las gracias también a nuestra hermana Iana y a nuestro hermano Iván
Amen.
por acompañarme para terminar esta serie. I had fun with you guys.
It was really fun.
Amen. I had a great time.
Amén, amén. Así que los esperamos todos la semana que viene en nuestro próximo episodio de Transcending Generation Table Talk. Esperamos que este episodio ha sido de bendición para cada uno de ustedes. Y si ustedes no conocen al Señor, les invito a que busque del Señor y que lea su palabra, porque el Señor está ahí a su puerta y está listo para recibirte en sus brazos. Así que el Señor les bendiga y nos vemos el próximo viernes de 12 de la tarde a 1 de la tarde. Que el Señor les bendiga y nos vemos.